So today I'm getting a little bit out of my usual field of expertise because today we are speaking about sword and how to actually hang your sword. So during the ages, from basically the end of the Roman Empire up to the Renaissance, there has been a lot of different way of hanging your sword. Some of them were really optimum for use on foot, some of them were optimum for use on horseback. There is all kind actually of settings that were used depending of the time period. So we start with basically the Dark Age, and now during the Dark Age we have this system which is really very convenient, a baldric system using that sort of little bridge here on the upper part of the scabbard to just like pass the baldric. And the baldric is worn quite high actually. It's adjustable of course, but it's worn quite high. And this is a very interesting configuration because it's extremely versatile, very optimized for negotiating like hard terrain, any kind of environment where you are actually a bit confined. So if you're aboard a ship, for example, or if you are just like storming a castle or that kind of stuff, knowing that if you want a bit more stability, you could pass your main belt over those two parts of the baldric. So basically your belt passing over the baldric will stabilize tremendously the baldric and almost give you a configuration very similar to a sword hanging from your main belt, except that the weight will be hanging from your shoulder mostly and not from the belt, which will avoid actually the when you put weight on your belt, one side of the belt just do this. So this is not the case with that kind of configuration with the baldric and the belt on top, which is like already heard during antiquity. It's just like a continuation. So very versatile, can be worn with the belt on top or not, depending of how much you want to be able to take your sword, move it, or just like having a maximum stability. So of course this is not the only configuration that was available at that time. And we have much more complex one with 2 points of hanging like that, which give really a nice stability and a direction to the sword. As you can see, the sword is not vertical, it's aiming actually at 45 degrees. We do have other way of making the sword aim vertical, which is especially like the use of this lovely little shield with a belt passing through immediately. Here, that time, you already have your sword hanging from your belt and hanging from your belt quite high, because if you look where the point is, it's not at the very far end of the scabbard, it's quite high. So that means that actually the handle, the grip of your sword is basically almost right here. So it has advantages, it has drawbacks, and the main advantage is that the scabbard is really not getting in the way too much when you are running or when you're on a horse. Same, it's not going in the way too much. It's really, because it's worn so high, it's both stable and not interfering with your leg, whatever you are doing. So of course with time you will have more and more the tendency to just like aim the sword a little bit at 45 degrees. And one way of doing that was to use actually 2 points of attach that will basically be a little bit far away from each other. So it can be worn with that kind of system with a snake tongue passing through and lacing, or it can be used with a buckle, of course. During the 12th century, we start to see something interesting. That system actually of double belt, which actually is very convenient for wearing your sword a bit lower. So here the sword is really at your tight level, and as a matter of fact, it's quite convenient in many. Actually, it's fashionable, and there is clearly a part of fashion here. But it's also convenient when you are on horseback to have the sword more vertical and not aim too much horizontal. Because when the sword is too much at horizontal, it can basically just touch the back of your horse and give wrong information, give wrong a signal that might actually upset your mount or just like miss with whatever you are trying to make him do. So that's a configuration that will actually evolve in many different way. So from simple one to slightly more complex one, and this is stopping. Okay, so the screen just got disabled, but that's fine. Let's get back. So configuration will evolve with time, always with that same idea of how do you want to carry your sword? Do you want to carry your sword very vertical, or do you want to carry your sword actually more at an angle? And there is many ways actually of reaching that point. Once again, you can have the two different hanging points that will give a natural inclination to the sword, and they can be more or less apart from each other depending on the time period and depending of how actually angle you wish to have your sword. They can be made of metallic fittings, they can be made of an additional loop, they can be made actually of a very ornate belt with fittings, they can be made of a double belt system, they can be made simply with two little ring, and then the sword will hang very vertically. And on the other hand, if you want actually the opposite, if you want your sword to be hanging quite at an angle, then quite soon we will start to see systems that will have actually this configuration with a double strap here and the one single adjustable one, usually with hooks, and here usually with a ring. And this form will evolve in many different configurations. So you can have like different small chains, you can have actually different hangings, but the most classic this one is totally unusual, but the most classic configuration quite soon will become that kind of stuff. So we have a double strap on that side that will usually reach a ring here, sometimes with hooks, sometimes with a double loop, sometimes there is many different configurations. Sometimes this can be actually one single piece of leather on which you will make actually a kind of loop knot, and this loop knot will just go, so your belt will go through that loop knot. But whatever the circumstance and whatever the system chosen, you have that double strap that is giving actually the main stability of your sword. And then your sword is brought back by this third strap here, either hooking a little ring right over there, or directly using that part of the belt, so the hanging part of the belt, to directly tighten to a buckle existing here. So these are different configurations, but all are meeting more or less the same purpose. So you can see that kind of configuration here, very typical. This is the kind of configuration that I was explaining. You have actually here a small hook that will hook itself on that ring here, and then what you will do is basically you will just like put your sword here, and those two straps will be hanging there. You will pass your belt, buckle your belt, and then you have a long hanging part right over there. And this hanging part you will use actually to pass this long hanging part in that buckle, and that buckle right over there. So you will pass it here, and you will tighten it as much as you want, just to give a lot of stability to your sword. Because here you have those two hanging, so the two main strap, and then the third one will actually bring your sword a bit further in front of you, and will give actually that third point of hanging that really give a lot of stability. So this is how it is working. And of course you can have like loop like this, but you can also have metallic fitting to hang your sword. So you can have like different configuration depending of actually how you want to hang that. Some involve a lot of metallic fittings, some involve like quite fixed stuff with small chain. Okay, that one is a very classical one, a very good example actually. That one is also a very good example, very classic. You find here actually a knot, you find here the little ring, and you find the double strap hanging from here. And as you can see, you have the long belt here that will go all around you, be buckled first time on that ring, on that buckle here, and then the long hanging part will be buckled actually passing through a second buckle, that one, and will be actually buckling and bringing your sword in the right position. So let's see what's next. Okay, once again, similar configuration with knot here. You can actually reach something quite complex by the beginning of the 16th century. And slowly we will move towards the usual rapier carrier. So rapier carrier, actually the main idea of the rapier carrier is just taking the idea of the 15th century but bringing it one step further. You see actually it starts to evolve in a full piece of leather that is that is really creating that typical stuff that is highly recognizable at the end of the 16th century. So you have a full piece of leather, usually with adjustable strap here with a lot of buckle. You have a hook, and then you still have that system for giving the additional stability. So we are still in the same idea of the 14th and 15th century configuration that was using just a double strap. But here we are really pushing it very far, because this is literally like total solid sturdy leather. And because it's usually a bit thick, it has actually shape of its own, and it's very stable because it's not just like two straps. It's really a big piece of leather, and that's holding its own shape. So it comes in a variety of configuration, but always the same idea. You hook it, and after that you have a long strap passing forward. So this is actually a slight later evolution. This is a 17th century evolution, and we still have actually the idea of a lot of buckle and strap, but this time it's directly put on the baldric for a saber. So this is clearly a usual typical use for cavalry. In 17th century, the cavalry evolved tremendously. Generalization of firearms, the almost disappearance of heavily armored cavalry. You still have Hazelridge lobsters and all that kind of cavalry still playing a part. But more and more you will go for the arquebusier and for all kind of medium and light cavalry that will use the pistol as the main weapon and use a saber actually to engage in hand-to-hand fighting. And with time we will go back to the charge with cold steel, because it's proven that the charge with cold steel will have better results than the people just like using mainly the firearm. And that's an interesting evolution, but that will be the topic of another video. And so at that time we reach actually the end of the evolution for the classic sword. There is of course a few exceptions that are really not fitting in that configuration and that brief presentation. And the first exception would be of course the genuine big 200. Until now we have spoken mostly about arming sword and long sword. So the arming sword is really the arming sword, or just a sword, because at beginning of Middle Age it's just sword. But the arming sword is really a backup weapon, the kind of stuff that you can conveniently carry in daily life or when you are using another weapon as your main weapon on the battlefield. So the arming sword is not the most efficient sword available in late Middle Age, for example, but it is the more convenient to carry around. A long sword can still be carried at your belt or at a baldric because it's still manageable. A long sword, bastard sword, you do actually have a few mention of bastard sword in French sources, but whatever, let's call them long sword. So they are long enough to be used in two hand, use all the kind of fencing master treatises like Fiore or Lichtenauer, all of that kind of stuff, but they are not truly big 200 sword like the giant big Svander and all that, the Montante, the Spadone, and all that kind of big 200 swords that clearly can no longer be worn on the belt because it's not workable anymore. It's so big that actually even if you give them a step angle, you are being a nuisance either for your horse or for the people behind you, because those monsters are huge, and the more huge they are, the more impossible it is to wear them at the belt. I mean, like literally when you start to have those giant swords, it's totally impossible to wear them on the belt. So those one obviously require to be worn on usually on the shoulder, very simply, occasionally simply from hanging in your bag in a simple transport configuration. But there is other exception, of course, and there is a lot of sword, basically not of defense weapons, secondary weapons that were worn not in the usual vertical manner, not in the usual 45-degree manner, but clearly in a very horizontal manner, because they were like small enough to be used that way and carried that way, and because at some time it was fashionable to do so. And obviously we think about the Katzbalger, so typical in the Holy Roman Empire, that you see on the Langsnesh, and that was very often worn totally horizontal like that. And that has some advantages. It was not always worn horizontal, obviously, but that is some kind of fashion that was practical because the Katzbalger is not that big. There is example of huge one, but usually they are not that big. They are really actually a backup weapon. So even if you are holding it horizontal, you are not actually annoying too much the people around you, because when you are Langsnesh, you are fighting in a pike block, or even if you are fighting in with a Sveander or something like that, your backup weapon is not getting in the way at all. So we just lose the screen. Let's bring it back. Okay, we recover the screen. So just as I said, the Katzbalger was actually a bit unusual because it was not using the classic way of hanging a short weapon. That was like, for example, whenever we are using a messer, you have different way of actually hanging a messer. Many different fashion of hanging it, from the simplest one to a two-hanging point, to really a two-hanging point with two rings on the belt, and all kind of different fashions that were actually, well, very comfortable, very convenient. But for whatever reason, sometimes it was fashionable to just wear your sword at the horizontal. And on the other hand, you do have configurations that are convenient for Basla or kind of stuff like that, where you really have your short weapon totally vertical. So that's also a very nice and convenient configuration that's meeting the same purpose, basically. And so that was a brief overview of how you can be wearing your sword in the Middle Age and early Renaissance. There were actually a lot of different ways of doing that. All of them have advantages and drawbacks, and at the same time period you could have several ways of wearing your sword actually coexisting at the same time and at the same place. Some of them were more prevalent, either for fashion reason or for just like convenience reason, because it was meeting the requirement of a specific type of troop. But usually at the same time period, you almost always have different way of carrying your sword. So that's it. That was not exactly my field of expertise, my usual field of expertise, but I'm always happy to satisfy friends' curiosity, and I sincerely hope that you will love it.